So glad that you're here with us. And the folks who I see we have lots of people who are new to our webinars. And so just wanted to very quickly introduce ourselves. Inspire HR is a team of HR experts, and we're kind of this secret weapon to CHROs and CEOs alike. We parachute into organizations in one of three ways: either interim work covering open roles or hard to fill spots that have been open too long. We help lean teams get done that mountain of work that they need to get done, or we do development and upskilling, whether it's employees across the board or HR folks on your team. So we're 37 experts strong across the country, and we parachute into both Fortune 500s and high growth companies alike. So thank you so much for joining this community today. Back in the spring, many of us gathered, we're very much looking forward to Labor Day. Labor Day was seen as that kind of big switch on where we were going to begin to implement the long thought through and strategized plans for hybrid or return to office and begin to actually be together in person with more frequency. As I always say, I plan, God laughs. With the surge of the Delta variant throughout the summer caused many companies to really stop in their tracks and rethink plans as they saw organizations, including Apple, Lyft, Indeed, Google, and Shutterstock, really start to think ahead and say, Labor Day, not quite sure what if that is the right date for us. Meanwhile, before Labor Day and before even the New York City school district opened, many Northeast schools had reopened. And before Labor Day, there were already 1,400 school closures nationwide, and caregivers really grappling with how to do that juggle with the rise of the COVID variant. So it seems like we thought we were getting back on track and COVID had other plans. But I'm a big believer of always looking for the silver linings, as I know many of you are, and we cannot just hold our collective breath and wait for more stable times. This is very much a time in flux, but we find that many employees are really feeling like they need their companies to show that there is an adult in the room. They need to be reassured that someone is at the wheel and that their company is not just floating off course. And that is very much why we created this session today. The best companies out there are creating flexible plans. They're communicating like nobody's business, and they're thinking about the implications of the hybrid work model for the future. And that's very much what we wanted to talk about today, from compliance to culture and how to really make that happen. I'm thrilled that we have three leaders. We are in very capable hands together, and their collective experience across employment law, DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, as well as HR, puts us in a very good place at the top of the hour to seize the opportunities in this very changing environment. It is my honor to welcome Carrie Heslin, who's an employment attorney and partner at Nook, Freeman and Sarah, where she specializes in litigation on behalf of employers. Sarah Birmingham, the Chief Human Resources Officer at Shutterstock, who Inspires had the pleasure of working with on talent acquisition, and Camille Henderson Davis, who is one of our 35 plus Inspire experts who specializes in DEIB and holds a PhD in history and race theory. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you here today. So thank you for making the time. So I want to dive right in, and let's start with that big picture planning. I'd love to kind of set the table and think through how can HR leaders be proactive in planning and communicating expectations with their employees when things are in such flux. And Sarah, I'd love to start with you.
Well, thanks, Jamie, and very happy to be here today. And as we know, thinking about proactive and communication regular to employees is very important in any circumstance, but right now even more important with everything that's like you said, in flux. At Shutterstock, what we did immediately was we pulled a collaborative team together: legal, finance, HR, all the people that we needed input on a regular basis, and really we had them own the things that we needed to think about. What's the internal input that we're getting from our employees? Are we surveying them? What's the pulse? And then what's happening externally, right? So what are all the factors that you have to consider globally, locally, et cetera? And really, putting together those outcomes of what we needed on a regular basis just to get that information. The other thing that was really important for us was, what are the tenets of how we want to think about this, right? Flexibility, well-being, safety. so important. So any decision we make has to be grounded in those tenets. Then when we thought about what we need as sort of an outcome when we do return and what that looks like, what is that going to, how do we reimagine that to get excited about it and really create an opportunity around it? Thinking about collaboration, thinking about accountability, right? How do we drive more ownership around how you work and your outcomes? Competitiveness, how do we stay competitive as an organization? And then of course, obviously flexibility and happiness and what's going to work in the end for productivity, maximum productivity for our employees. So really thinking about those decisions and how you just make decisions based on those factors. And then obviously communication.
Right.
Developing Slack channels, FAQs, in the moment as we have information, how are we getting it to our employees and what's the best method to do that? Is our CEO talking about it at every company update? Am I giving an update? Things like that you just need to consider. The other really important thing in this is about planning. Obviously, we've changed our lives to accommodate everything that's happening. So really thinking about how to give notice to our employees to say, how much time do they need? So if you're going to go out and say, like you said, oh, it's Labor Day that we're going back, which we all know in most cases didn't happen. Setting that, if there's an unknown, really setting that time frame for them so they understand that we're going to give them time. So what we did is we said, you will have 8 weeks notice on any decision we make. So that way you have 2 months to plan your life and adjust accordingly. And then, just like I said, constantly, if there's something that's happening or an update, how are you really pushing that out, but also taking that pull in so that you understand what the pulse of your employees is at any given moment.
It's fantastic. I'm so admiring your holistic approach. And 8 weeks is, I think that feels like there's an adult in the room. That feels like, thank you. Like there's a guideline that I can think about to plan both on the work front and the home front. It's great. Carrie, anything to add? I know that you see trends across so many of your clients.
I think on the aspect of communicating to employees, I do think that as much advance notice as possible, even though things are changing. I mean, even though you may have a team, as most of our clients do, behind the scenes, cross-functionally working on all the issues, communicating that to your team, even if you don't have an answer yet, letting them know that you are working on it and here is our plan and you are going to have the advance notice, and communicating that in multiple ways. So, town halls, Zoom meetings, follow-up emails, before bringing people back to work, maybe trainings on what the return to work is going to look like. So really comprehensively communicating to them what the plan is going to be. I think it makes that kind of uncertainty and that during this influx time more manageable for them. And then that allows them to focus on doing their job and not worrying about it.
Absolutely. It's like, tell them what you told them and tell them what you told them again. And, we learn from an HR perspective that all adults learn differently. So sometimes hearing things, auditory, visually, reinforcement, all of those things help. I want to jump right to the thing I think that is on so many leaders' minds, which is how can managers best navigate vaccine mandates among employees who do not want to get vaccinated? And Carrie, as a lawyer and our group here, I'd love to start with you. How do you even begin? Yeah.
So for starters, it should not be left to the managers to have to navigate this. You really need someone at any company, regardless of size, who is going to be responsible for communicating the company's policy regarding vaccines, and then intaking and then managing and dealing with individuals who, if you have a vaccine mandate, don't want to get vaccinated. I mean, there are legal requirements that you're going to have to meet that managers probably wouldn't understand or know, right? There are potential medical accommodations, there are potential religious observance accommodations that have to be taken into account. Also, there are a host of various ways in which someone who's not vaccinated could be accommodated. It could be a continuation of work from home. It could be a leave of absence. It could be weekly testing in lieu of a vaccine. So that it really depends on the unique circumstances of the employee and their job. But it is important that there is kind of a centralized place where people know they will go to have those issues addressed, because you don't want to have people being treated differently in the organization. And then, potentially raising complaints or claims of unfair treatment. And so, there's a lot of, even though there's the legal requirements, there's also kind of the soft skills and the
Mhm.
moral issues that go around mandating a vaccine. So
Right.
once the company makes a decision, part of that decision has to be, how are we going to handle those who may not be vaccinated, and having a
Mhm.
comprehensive plan and strategy for
Mhm.
that.
And being sensitive to that. Yeah, Camille, I'd love your thoughts on this. You are our culture expert.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important and challenging about all of this is, how do I actually have that one-on-one conversation with an employee successfully? I mean, it's a little intimidating. And I think that the most important thing to do when you step into the room is to try to separate the position the person holds from the person.
Mhm.
This can't become a test of wills. The person
Mhm.
can't feel shamed or
Mhm.
stupid, but instead just making as transparent as possible
Mhm.
your underlying agenda. You want to
Right.
keep everybody safe.
Sure.
You've created a plan to do that, and you want them to participate in
Mhm.
that plan. Then the question becomes, what are the issues that are surfacing for you that are making the vaccine such a scary thing? And how do we partner to address those issues and move you through that process if
Mhm.
possible?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I'm seeing so many notes in the chat that the sensitivity is key. Everyone is in their own place on this journey. So just being sensitive, there are so many underlying factors for folks. Um, so with return to office and hybrid planning as the top priority for so many leaders, so many folks that I see here who have joined us today, how do we ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, what we at Inspire call DEIB, and culture are not relegated as nice to have, but are seen as essential as would any other piece of the return to office plan? Camille, I'd love to kick that one off with you.
Yeah. DEIB done well looks at two things: diversity, which are the gateways into your company, those decisions you make about who to hire, who to promote, how much to pay them, and inclusion, which are the pathways through the organization
Mhm.
for every employee. And it's those moments when employees get those sort of informal and formal signals about whether they belong: project assignments, development opportunities, the dynamics of team communication, and that overall sense of visibility and
Mhm.
value.
Mhm.
To keep DEIB and its cultural impacts front and center, I think we need to look carefully at how those gateways and pathways could be influenced
Mhm.
by the decisions you're making about your RTO
Mhm.
strategy and your
Mhm.
hybrid work plan. So, are your gateway decisions equitable? What are
Mhm.
the potential unintended consequences or possible
Mhm.
outcomes that you need to think really carefully about? And do your pathways signal belonging and development
Mhm.
for every employee? And not only how do you ensure that, but how do you sort of turn the signal strength up on that message and sort of use this rethinking to really look at those questions?
I was speaking to one of our clients who's an attorney this morning, and they are so looking to very much retain females. And what they're finding is that with all the uncertainty with school, it's really tricky in terms of, historically what we've read the last 18 months is that females tend, the mother in the home tends
Yeah.
to take on that role of owning any hybrid school, any type of basically keeping the house scotch taped together, right? So it's like, they've worked so hard to attract and retain women, and they're really worried about that during this time. It's so real for so many organizations. Sarah, do you have anything to add on that? I know that this is an area of passion for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Camille said is right on. And I also think one of the things that we are sort of making sure that we're on top of is that really that inclusion piece with,
Mhm.
a population coming, not coming back and being remote, and then a population coming into the office. So, and you just mentioned mothers, women, et cetera. How are we making sure that you still have a team environment where people are feeling that they're being treated equitably,
Mhm.
and that you can still connect as a team and together without disparity or things happening. So
Mhm.
training is a big piece of that. So how do we now train our leaders to show up and be able to think about these things that they didn't
Mhm.
necessarily have to think about before
Mhm.
in a big way? So
Mhm.
I think that's really important.
Mhm. And we always hear, we do so much DEIB strategy with companies, and we talk about how it's actually in some ways dialed up their inclusive culture, because pre-pandemic, for people who were from traditionally marginalized groups to have access to the top of the house, they would need their badge to have the swipe card to get up to like the highest, floor in the skyscraper to get access to that sea level. And now literally you can just send them something on chat because everyone's in the same Brady Bunch boxes. So it actually, that there are just countless ways in which I think it has felt more inclusive for many folks. But with return to office, I love, Camille, what you said about being so intentional and thinking about those pathways through the organization, because there's also this piece around just promotion and development, right? Those relationships that often have so much happen by people bumping into each other in elevator banks or having the post conversation coming out of the conference room meeting. So just being really intentional to create space for those things as people move through the organization.
Yeah.
So companies like Google, Twitter, Morgan Stanley, they've all considered this idea of reducing pay for workers who choose to work from home, depending on where that employee lives, right? What's their new zip code that they hail from? Other companies like Zillow and Reddit have specifically said, no way, they're not adjusting pay rates. And I'm just curious if anyone has a point of view on that, because I'm wondering, what is the best practice? Should we consider when determining, what is the decision tree when you decide whether to adjust pay rate if you choose to work remotely? Sarah, I know that you have had to think this through a bit. If you want to kick that one off.
Yeah. So, part of what we talked about at Shutterstock was how do we do it today, right? And then why would we amend and why wouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have decided that just working remotely is not a cause to reduce pay. However, we tend to pay based on local market conditions, what's happening. So do you have an eye on sort of where the market pressures are and what's happening in certain locations? So if an employee decides that they, are going to move from New York to Florida, Idaho, we would look at their pay and determine sort of, are they above market? Are they in market? And adjust accordingly. So that's our stance. And we think that is probably just the most equitable. So if I decide I want to work from home versus come in the office, we chose not to penalize someone or reduce pay. However, definitely continuing our normal practice of looking at the competitive market.
Based on the region, based on the geographic indicators. Yep, I think that sounds really fair.
Yeah.
So with my lawyer hat on,
bring it. We want to hear it.
Yes. To that, right? So companies do have to be concerned whenever they are adjusting pay, especially adjusting pay potentially downward. You do have to be concerned about whether there's any adverse impact that policy is going to have on a protected group of individuals. So even a policy that's neutral on its face, if it has an adverse impact on a group of individuals that are in a same protected class, there is a potential for a challenge to that policy under, federal or state anti-discrimination laws. So I think you have to be very cognizant of that. And if you're going to make those types of changes, run it by legal, run it by an employment lawyer, to make sure that you're not going to run into something that you think, again, a lot of times employment laws are counterintuitive. What you think you should or can or want to do, may need some vetting before you actually do it.
Yep, absolutely. And Sarah, knowing you for as long as I have, there's no doubt in my mind you make any decisions without your employment attorney advising you.
Yeah, and I think too, for us, it's about what is our policy, and is that something that is equitable across? So are we not just making decisions in the moment, case by case, but doing it more based on how we're treating the entire employee population?
Yeah, and I'm curious, how have people reacted? What kind of feedback have you gotten?
People think it's reasonable. So to be honest, not a ton of pushback.
Yeah.
I think when you educate them and when you make it clear that that's what you're doing, and we have. So when we rolled our communication on this, that was an FAQ, and we were very clear that we absolutely would be doing this.
Yes.
And so we haven't, to be honest, gotten a ton of pushback on that. Yeah.
I think companies have to be cognizant right now of any policy changes they make, the impact it may have on their employees because of the big competition for talent that is on right now. There is a lot of movement in the workforce right now. And, many companies have already recognized that, if you have really great folks and you lose them, the cost of rehiring, the timeline right now for rehiring and the cost of retraining can be pretty significant. So we're seeing a lot of companies really being mindful about what the impact of any policy changes may have on their existing talent, especially if they love the people they have.
Yeah. I saw a question in the chat
Yeah.
about people moving around, and we have wrestled with that quite a bit at Shutterstock. We are not, we do not employ in every state. We do not employ in every country. So it's been a big topic of discussion when employees come and say, we want to move to Costa Rica. Can I do that? Right. And we don't, we aren't set up in that country or state
Yeah.
to work. So we've had to tackle that and say, look, if your role is set to be remote, you can live in any state that is that we are eligible to work in, right, or country. So we have gone out to the employee population and said, we'll consider it as long as it is an area that we can employ in, based on time zones and role, et cetera.
Right.
We then weigh that decision with a group of folks that are consistent.
It's a big decision to set up in a new state. I know we have folks for Inspire across 12 states, and there's a cost. Like there are laws and compliance things and employment insurance for all of our folks are W-2s, and just we've become quite astute at all these different states, and that's why I'm always calling Carrie's firm just to stay on top of all of that. Yeah, that could alone be a full-time job, especially for so many folks in the HR department as this unfolds. And Camille, I was thinking of you from a DEIB perspective, just making sure that as folks are thinking through, remote versus working from home and all the implications, just making sure that communication feels equitable. I know also, the BIPOC community has been so largely impacted by COVID, has had just more people lost, more people hospitalized, and it's been heavy. And I just want to make sure that when we think about those plans, that we're taking that DEIB lens into account as well.
Yeah, you raised something before we began the conversation about just sort of having that authentic reach out in whatever way makes sense, where you're saying, how are you really doing? And holding enough space for that, for the employee to come back and give you a real answer, not a drive-by, tail end of the meeting sort of a question. And I think that really sends a very different signal to employees about the sincerity of the question, whether there's room for them to give a real answer, and whether they can actually ask for what they need in terms of what work, how work might look a little bit differently for them, especially if they feel like it's very particular to their background, their culture, or if they are in a minority group, that there is a sense that they might be judged differently by asking for something that might be a normal request if it's a man or a white person asking for it. And I think all those things are really important for us to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Please.
No, I just think too, that's such a good point, that you have to be open to thinking about things potentially differently today, right? So you do need to amend policy or practice based on what's happening in today's world. So keeping that open mind when you're getting things come to you to say, okay, how wowould we do this now today that may be different considering everything that's going on versus, what's in the employee handbook. So it is, and you have to kind of weigh everything, all the implications together to make those decisions.
Absolutely. We're working with so many clients now on training leaders on this whole concept of managing remote. And one thing that we really talk about is that there are brand new leadership competencies in town. And historically, things that, certain characteristics were the things that help you rise. So for some companies, it was how good you were at networking, how good you were at golf. I don't know, like how good your work ethic was. If there was a new client in Chicago, would you jump on a plane with a moment's notice to kind of go in and do the pitch? And during these times, competencies are more around showing up authentically, seeing someone as a whole person, emotional intelligence. I mean, these competencies did not get a whole lot of airtime pre-pandemic. And what we're seeing during this time across all of our clients is that it is like a magnetic attraction. People want to work for leaders who see them as a whole person, understand that this pandemic of ours did not last 2 weeks. It took a little bit, we're still in it, and really help them edit sometimes hours, a little bit of goal setting to really retain that person. And it is an employee's market. There's a turnover tsunami so many of us have been speaking about. So really showing up very differently for the coveted talent that you treasure and retaining them. And as someone said earlier, as we were preparing, employees have long-term memories and they will remember the employer that showed up for them. Just one quick thing that I want to jump to our poll. Last year, we had a diversity leader from IBM on our panel. And she shared a beautiful concept. IBM has something called, I'm going to get it wrong, the well-being or the wellness pledge. And from the CEO down, there's a commitment that we check in with people. We are each other's keepers. We make sure that we look at people as a whole person with a focus on well-being. And I love that. Just weaving that into any organization's DEIB strategy, I think just makes it a richer one for sure. So Melissa, if we could, I'd love to launch the poll. We're so curious if we could just get a quick pulse check. It's always great to check in with the community and inspire. We'd love to have your input on what is your company's vision for its future workplace, remote versus hybrid when it feels safe versus return to office when it feels safe. Fascinating. I'm seeing by a landslide, 76% say hybrid when it's safe. Fascinating. So we are all reimagining the future of work. Fascinating. Okay. So with that, I'd love to go to the next question, which is, we don't know what we don't know, right? And it's hard to keep up with this changing landscape with so much on leaders' plates. So I actually woke up to a difficult statistic today. It said that we have at this point had more deaths due to this pandemic than that of the entire Spanish flu of 1918. And sometimes my family and friends say it's like, I'm like the woman who knows too much. I read too many studies from epidemiologists and all the CDC so that we can very much keep up with things for our clients. But I also feel like it's so important to be the smartest one in the room and have that data so you can really make the important decisions. So I don't mean to be the voice of gloom and doom, but I do think it's important that leaders have that information to very much weave it into the business case and the human case for the decisions that they're making. So we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what is ahead, but I'd love to hear what is one implication of the shift to hybrid that you think HR leaders are not paying enough attention to, right? All of us have a certain list of things that we're focused on, but I'd love if you, and Carrie, maybe we'll start with you. I'd like to widen the aperture. What are things that this whole shift to hybrid that 76% say will be their future? What is something else that this HR community needs to be thinking about that we're not currently laser focused on? And Carrie, I'll kick it off with you, and then I'd love to hear from each of you.
Thanks. So I think that life in the workplace was easy when everyone was there.
Yeah.
And life in the workplace was more challenging, but easier when everybody was remote. The hybrid workplace is going to be a whole new world. And again, people will say, oh, we always had someone that worked remote. But if you have 99% of your people in the office and you had one person that was participating by a conference call, it wouldn't necessarily disrupt the flow, the ability to communicate, the team building, the efficiency of the group. But now if you're going to be in a situation where people have fluctuating work schedules and you could have 50% of people in a meeting on remote and 50% in office, you really have to think about putting in place and being very practical about putting in place policies, practices, and technology that's going to make that seamless. Because the challenges that we're hearing from our clients about why they maybe don't want to allow employees to work remotely is, how is that person going to effectively participate in a team meeting? What if they can't hear us? What if they can't raise their hand? What if they don't have their camera on and we can't see them? So it's really being very mindful about having the right technology and then putting into place kind of the ground rules about even how you handle a meeting. And if everyone's in a room, it's easy to read people's body language. It's easy to say, okay, hey, so-and-so, you're raising your hand. What do you want to add to this conversation? Yes. And it's very easy to leave people kind of out of the conversation if they're sitting on a screen at the end of the conference table. So putting into place protocols for how are we going to hold a meeting if half the people are remote? Everyone's going to be required to go around the room and take a turn? Is someone going to facilitate? Is someone going to be monitoring the chat? Just coming up with whatever works for your business, but being very mindful about how you structure interactions in a hybrid workplace.
I love every single thing that you said. Most people I know had at least one treasured meeting during this little patch of time that we had where it felt safe-ish. And I was one of those people. And we had such a laugh because boy, the first 10 minutes were that some people were on a, some people were on a screen, some people were there. We couldn't, it literally carried, like it took us time to figure out how people could see each other. And I thought if I could do it over, I would have had my team set up the room in advance so we didn't kind of waste our time. But those types of new rules of the road, I think are key. Also, let's just be honest, we really haven't seen people below their shoulders for a long, long time. And you do miss a lot, like the body language, which is what the brain uses to take in information. Like if the legs are crossed, how they're sitting, if their hands are tapping, all those things show if someone has buy-in. So all of those things have to be replicated in this hybrid. So much there. This is like, I feel like SNL is going to have great material when they come back on in the fall with all this hybrid stuff. Camille, thoughts from you?
Yeah, one thing I think is important implication to think about is to look really closely at your culture and ask yourself what's key about who we are, but something we do really informally. And then sort of step back and say, well, how do I evolve that so that it keeps happening and we get that outcome and make that outcome intentional, even if it looks kind of different than it originally did? How do I preserve those elements or evolve those elements so that they keep doing the things they need to do to help us be who we are?
Absolutely. We had a panel a few months back with Erica Keswin, who had this great expression. She said, think of the thing that makes you most feel like you're part of that culture. Like what's most NFC-ish? Or like, what are you doing when you feel like you're most Shutterstock-ish? Like there were things pre-pandemic that we did, whether it was, hanging out in the break room or the thing for someone's birthday where you're like, yeah, this is us. How do you recreate that feeling where you feel like it's most like your culture? It has to really be edited and thought through to kind of keep that cultural glue. The other thing, Camille, I'm thinking one of our clients told me on Friday, they've had 400 employees start since January. And the CEO was saying, Jamie, none of us have ever been in the same room. Like with so many companies growing during this time. And so turnover, you have people who never experienced the break room. They never experienced birthdays otherwise. So how do you also bridge those two pieces of culture, newbies that onboarded during pandemic and people who knew it another way pre-pandemic? Sarah, thoughts from you on things that we have to keep in mind?
Yeah, and I think too, and all of us have maybe experienced this who have sort of come back a bit, is those social norms, right? So that professionalism, the how you show up, how you think about sort of interaction in a live meeting versus not. So those reminders, it's important to sort of make sure and have that patience that people are, are working through it. The other thing that's interesting is, when you are at home, your ability to respond or multitask or get back to someone, is a lot more than when you're going from meeting to meeting to meeting in the office and you're having to be in person and your ability to multitask doesn't exist if you're in person. So I think the understanding and the patience that, look, work might change a bit, productivity might change just a bit in these moments. So I think that's important to just note. The other important thing is, and you said this, Jamie, but what are the new competencies that we need? Do our goals shift because of that remote versus hybrid? Does performance management look different, right? So it's about measuring outcomes versus activity or face time. So I can't see what you're doing necessarily. So how do I think about goals and outcomes in order to make sure we're managing more effectively?
I love so many things you said. So first up, the readjusting. It is amazing how much you can get done below your shoulders when that part of your body is not on screen, right? Like I was on a meeting once with someone and I heard a little bit of a whirling noise in the background afterwards. They said, I hope we don't mind. It was my only time to get in a workout. And I have basically it's like a bike under the desk, and they biked so many miles. I had another client who does, God love her. She set up where there's like a treadmill situation, and oh my gosh, she's getting it done. But it's a little bit of really, as we re-engage, realize that two things: one, that level of professionalism, and two, the piece around just, seeing each other and realizing that the productivity may not be there. Because I think what a lot of organizations have realized is when you have people who can do back-to-back Zooms and you take away the commute or you take away their time to get gussied up, they really can get so much more done. And I think that what I'm hearing from folks is when they're in the office, there is more time spent with hallway catching up, or the moment after a meeting where someone says, do you have a second? So like you're not going to your next Zoom meeting back to back. It's that you're talking to someone for 15 minutes in the hallway, and all those things add up. So just giving each other the grace and space to kind of get used to that norm, and also realizing that the people who are not in person are missing out on some conversations, or missing out perhaps on some bonding, and calling that out. Because I want to touch on the second thing you said, which is the whole employee experience, from the way that we recruit and onboard and develop and internal comp, like all of it has had to be thought through. The way that we elegantly exit someone and offboard them all feels differently now.
Yeah.
So to think through the whole employee experience.
And change management, right? So huge change management here. So someone has to be completely dedicated to thinking through what does that change look like for people, and it's different for some and others.
Absolutely. Such a good point.
Jamie, I saw someone in the chat asked about what about technology that can be used to monitor productivity or utilization or competency or outcomes rather. You know, in the beginning of the pandemic, I had a number of clients that were coming to us and say, like, what about this technology where they can trace, you know, people being on their keyboards, keystrokes, or how do I make sure my people are really working? And what we found in talking with our clients is, you know, nobody, no matter what level they're at, wants to be micromanaged to that level. So I think what's important in the hybrid workplace or the remote workplace is building in regular performance reviews and check-ins so that you are focused on, you know, not necessarily what the person is doing every second, but are they getting the job done?
Yeah.
And empowering people to figure out how to get it done. Yes, you still have to require people to clock in and out, especially if they're, you know, non-exempt employees. But really on the productivity and the success of their work, I think it's more about building in an appropriate management style for the hybrid workplace. You can't just pop into someone's office if people aren't in the office every day to see what they're doing or ask them. But then you do have to be mindful as a manager to build that into your management of folks.
Absolutely. And that is exactly, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's exactly what we're covering in our class on how to manage in a hybrid. It is a very different way of assessing. So, you know, Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that, just in terms of, you know, the whole employee experience and just thinking through leaders' comfort in how they're assessing outcomes and results? It's a very different way of looking at things. You know, some folks are in careers where it's very clear. It's very clear what the outcome is. But for a lot of folks I'm seeing who are with us here today, it's more gray.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one of the biggest things. And look, every leader views this differently. So, you know, it is about ultimate productivity, right? And I do think having a vision and having everyone understand kind of what their role is in that and what their piece is, and being, you know, one of the things that we're working on is really driving that empowerment and accountability, because we need now people to be able to make decisions at all levels, because we can't run down the hall and say, hey, you know, can you sign this quickly? Can you do this? So thinking about, you know, trust, how do I drive decision-making down further innovation? How do I create tools that can arm people to be able to make those decisions and have the information they need when they don't need to, you know, when they can't necessarily access it from going down, knocking on someone's door. So all those things come into play when you're trying to think about how do you think about productivity in this world and then measure those outcomes. But I do think, you know, in the end, it is outcome driven. So you should be able to, you know, sit with your employee on a regular basis and say, okay, what have you accomplished towards these goals, and what that looks like, and continue that practice regularly.
Yeah. And Camille, what are your thoughts on that? Because there used to be more check-ins, and I know pre-pandemic people had a certain cadence of when they would assess goals and do check-ins, but what are your thoughts on that now in this hybrid environment?
It's really critical. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really critical to establish, particularly with your direct team, sort of what's the cadence that makes sense, not only for you as the leader, but paying attention to the individual needs of the members of your team, so that it's not like an employee who's pretty good on their own and feels like you're just constantly there.
Right.
Or someone who might be a little bit more hesitant to share and needs to be drawn out. How do you frame that check-in time so that they really feel invited to participate, and that you actually, this isn't a check the box, you actually want to hear where they're coming from?
Absolutely. And back to the IBM focus on the well-being pledge, I think that one-on-one check-ins are that time to have more of that intimate conversation, because everyone can kind of perform in a group setting of how they're really, really doing, but it's those one-on-ones where you can also check in on stress level, how they're doing the juggle, how the intensity of things is going for them. Please, I see lots of questions in the chat and some folks sent some in advance. So please keep those going. We have 2 more questions, then we'll go over to the questions that folks are asking. So some employees require more flexibility than others, for example, caregivers. How can managers promote flexibility, but also ensure that the employees who do not need as much flexibility are not left to feel resentful or maybe even take on extra work? This is something that we've heard time and again from clients, that equity piece. Sarah, do you want to kick that one off?
Sure. Yeah, this is a tough one. However, I think, and I talked a little about those tenets of how we want to think about them. I think flexibility in itself, has changed, right? So we all now, when we're working from home, we can run out and walk the dog on a break. We can do some things, and then we can work at 8 o'clock at night after we put the kids to bed. So I think introducing that level of flexibility into the workplace is very important. So starting off by sort of making sure that your environment is now encouraging that and saying, it is about, and I've said this a few times, it is about outcomes, not necessarily activity or that face time. So making sure you are equally giving employees opportunity to have that flexibility, whether it's remote employees or employees that are coming into the office. So I think that's important. I also think, shared goals across your team, so people understand what everyone's role is, and so I know what this person is supposed to deliver, and I understand that, and I know what I'm supposed to deliver, right? So we have that shared accountability, and we can share that if necessary. And then I think just something I said before, it's that regular check-ins. How are you doing? How is it working? What is your workload like? Making sure that in that new leader, environment, we need to be more conscious of these things. So how do we develop training for our leaders where that is, we are asking certain questions every time or one-on-one that might flesh some of these things out if we think there's issues.
Absolutely. And I think there are things that culturally society has historically said, well, that person needs flexibility, right? Things like they have an aging parent for which they're the primary caregiver, they have school-age children, but everyone who's human has a very full life outside of their job. And it's about all of those needs being weighed equally. And that I think a light has been shined on that also during the pandemic, that if you're human and you're awake, this has just been a lot. And it's important that we all honor that. Camille, thoughts from you from a DEIB and culture perspective?
Yeah, I think this comes down pretty critically to the way that the leader is communicating with his or her team. There is a sense that in both big and small groups, you need to be saying 3 things. 1, I want to know what we need, what you need to succeed in this environment. At the same time that you're saying back to the group, and I expect these needs to look differently, so that everybody's clear that we shouldn't all need the same thing. And then finally kind of stepping up as a leader and saying, and part of my job as we make this pivot, this evolution, is to say, I'm going to make sure that output remains equitable. So if you have concerns, bring them to me. But let's not let anything fester. And if you start to see those kind of subtle signals in the team dynamic that maybe things are getting a little bit haywire, you're taking the time to check in and really be intentional about that.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of those one-on-one check-ins, because in the big groups, it's hard for folks to maybe always speak their truth and say, I'm feeling a little bit underwater. It feels like things are inequitable. So those one-on-ones are sometimes the time to do it. So we're going to go to the Q&A in just a moment, but I wanted to close out hearing a little bit about what each of you are doing for self-care during this time. We as leaders, as HR professionals, we are all absorbers and end up being these kind of containers that hold the stress of others. And over time, we can feel like a container of lots of containers. And so I want to make sure that as a community, we are really prioritizing ritualized self-care. So I'd love to hear from each of you. We're always trying to crowd surf during these things. What are some great things you are doing to put on your own oxygen mask during this time? And Camille, let's start with you.
You know, I started the sort of rituals I used when I was the head of HR for a startup, and it was like a tsunami of needs. And I just felt like I learned pretty quickly that I couldn't give what I didn't have in the tank. And I read a great article by Tony Schwartz in HBR called Manage Your Energy, Not Your Time. And he talks about building these rituals that you use to sort of build yourself up instead of becoming this like master of personal efficiency. So the rituals I use, I exercise and I meditate every morning. I take, even if it's just 10 minutes, to like shut my door, eat my lunch, and read something fun because I'm an introvert and I need that.
Yes.
And I have a couple of times during the day, in the morning and at night, that are no email zones so that I can just focus on what's in front of me, be with my husband, play with
Yes.
the dog,
Yeah.
and just be in the moment.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. And what do you do for exercise? What's your thing?
Oh,
Runner.
it's weights, it's HIIT workouts, it's yoga, it's everything.
All of it. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Carrie, over to you. What are you doing?
So really throughout the pandemic, I've tried to do what I've always done to de-stress, which is get outside.
Mhm.
Spending so much time indoors, sitting in front of a computer, on the phone, reading documents. I feel really, getting connected back with nature by getting
Mhm.
outside, walks, hikes, even playing tennis outside, playing golf, just getting out in nature. And then also that just allows you to connect with people. And even if you're not talking to those people or hiking
Yes.
with us, just seeing other
Yes.
people and feeling like
Yes.
there's humanity is still out there,
Oh, yes.
has been really helpful for me.
Beautiful. Just even to say good morning to someone that you might be the only person that they interact with all day. So just to kind of put that energy out there. Sarah.
So I've been spending time out at my beach house in the Hamptons, which has been lovely. And so getting on the water has been sort of just very therapeutic for me. So I try to do that regularly. The other thing that I try to do most days is shut down for at least an hour at 5 o'clock. So it feels kind of like, okay, my day has a break in it when you go
Yes.
full on from 9 to 5 or even
Yes.
earlier. It's just nice for me to take a breath. And then if I need to jump back in, I can do that. And
Mhm.
like Camille said, it's sort of kind of that filling your tank back up.
Absolutely. That is, I've read that Tony Schwartz piece, Camille, and doing that, what you just described, Sarah, is very Tony Schwartz. He's the master of all things energy. Thank you. And we are going to keep this as a standing question on all of our future panels. We've been doing these for about 1.5 years, and this will be a standing question because I think that there's such a wealth of knowledge in the Inspire community. So we're going to your questions. Here we go. First up, do you have any tips for effective performance management techniques in a remote setting?
I would say what we are recommending to clients, something we talked about earlier, which is just building in regular performance review or check-in meetings. Now that people are comfortable getting out and about, we've asked people to start, managers to start building those in person.
Mhm.
Going out for a lunch, meeting for coffee, meeting
Mhm.
for a walk, but having those regular check-ins to get the
Mhm.
pulse of what's going on is really, I think, one of the easiest ways and quickest ways to get the feedback you need.
Absolutely. Great point. Camille, Sarah, any thoughts from you?
Having the right tools so that they can be interactive and that they can be intuitive. So it doesn't necessarily require constant in person. So what are the tools that you're using today that you can do constant check-ins and then you can update on a regular basis? So evaluating what are those tools that you have and are they fit for purpose in an environment where, you're mostly online.
So
one thing
go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
I think one thing I'd add to that is just, we make so many of our expectations around the outcome we want to see from an employee sort of informal and unspoken. And we kind of bump into each other a bunch and kind of accidentally evolve things out loud. And I think in this hybrid space, we need to take some time to be very intentional and clear and say, I need to look like this. I want it to, just lay the expectations out, get thoughts back, make sure things are maybe a bit more clear and defined than they often can be when you hand them off down the team.
Absolutely.
Is there Sarah, you'd mentioned before tools. Is there a internal system that you built or a hack or an app that you have? Is there an app for that?
I'll tell you, we are Slack
Slack.
constant.
Okay.
We're doing more on Slack, kind of that instant in the moment
Mhm.
tool that you can get feedback and communicate. So that's one tool that we're using, and we're now just looking at kind of performance management, and do we have the tool that
Okay.
will work. But yeah, Slack is huge for us.
Yes. Addicted to Slack, like most
Yeah,
of us. Okay.
and using it in every possible way we can. So
Yes.
advanced user of
Right.
Slack.
Like positive reinforcement, all of sharing, knowledge sharing. Yeah, all of it.
Pictures. Mhm.
Yes, all of it. Next up, how can HR help sway leaders who have more of a kind of old school approach that requires people to very much be in the office, or managers who give preference to those in the office, right? Seeing people working remotely, some leaders could perceive as less loyal or less serious. Any tips for that?
Yeah. Definitely had to do that a few times recently. It depends. I think you also have to assess, so where is that leader coming from, right?
Yeah.
What is it that they are driven by? What do they need? And what is it? Finance? Is it IT? What are the dynamics going on for them? And using data, one, and two, asking them to take a chance and give it a try, right? Using clear things to monitor. Let's try this for a month. Let's see what happens. Let's listen to that feedback that you're hearing from employees. The other thing that's coming to play right now, as we've discussed, is the market for talent, right? And retention is enormously important right now. So that tends to be a tool that does work to say, we do have to do different things today to retain our employees than we had to do in the past. And then, looking to attract employees is also equally important today. So attracting and retaining talent, and then kind of using data to say, look how productive your team has been.
Yes.
What are the data points we can use to influence them?
Yes. The coveted Gen Z, Gen Y, they used to historically be the ones who were asking to work from home and have that flexibility, but now it's pretty multi-generational. Carrie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, that question reminds me of the question we got for years with DEI, which was we had to make the business case. As Sarah said, you work with data, but you have to make the business case sometimes to the business leaders as to why there's a benefit to trying it or doing it this way. I also sometimes I think you just have to bring it to their attention. They may not almost subconsciously not realize that they are treating folks who are in the office different than folks who are remote. So bringing that to their attention, and with every good company, you would want to incentivize the behaviors that you want to see.
Always.
So we are seeing companies who are putting into place incentive comp programs that are tied to how effectively their managers help the hybrid model succeed.
What gets measured gets done.
Yeah.
Next up, and Carrie, this one has your name written all over it. What does a company do if they mandate vaccination, but some employees refuse? Do you think employees would have a powerful case to make in the court?
We are seeing litigation across the country challenging employer vaccine mandates, and they have not been successful. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the EEOC guidance provides for, in this type of pandemic situation where you've got a contagious disease that is impacting other employees and the communities at large, that employers can mandate vaccines. That is the state of the law right now, despite various legal challenges under various theories. So far, they've all been shot down. So employers are pretty safe to, at this point, mandate vaccines. I think the issue becomes more of, do you want to do it from a culture perspective? And then if you are going to do it, how are you going to manage? And you really have to think that through before you issue a mandate. How are you going to manage the situation with employees who don't want to? I'm a big proponent for, if you're considering a vaccine mandate, surveying your employee population to find out how much of your population isn't vaccinated. I've had employers that spend hours and hours, weeks debating whether or not to do it. And then they surveyed their employee population to find out 100% of their workforce was vaccinated. It made it really easy to pass
Right.
that,
Right.
you know? And if you find out half of your population is not, then you know it's going to be a bigger issue. And what's at risk is people leaving, people being disgruntled, people feel like they're not being treated fairly. So you really have to think through not just the issue of are we going to mandate vaccines, but how are we going to handle situations where if it's not, you know, look, if it's a medical accommodation, you have to go through that accommodation interactive process.
Mhm.
If it's a religious observation, you're
Mhm.
going to need some legal guidance on what does that
Right.
mean and how do you
Right.
handle those requests. We have larger companies that have put entire committees together just to handle accommodation requests. But if it's
Mhm.
just employees who have a moral or opinion that they don't want to get the vaccine and they don't have a legal basis for getting an accommodation, how as a business do you want to handle that? And again, it may depend on how many people are impacted by that.
Right. Right. And the cultural implications, as Camille was talking about before, just all this goes back to culture. We are at the top of our hour, and I want to thank so much Carrie, Camille, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing this knowledge with us. It is always great to see so many folks with us from the Inspire community, and we will be back together on October 20th, going very deep on culture, workplace culture, particularly in the hybrid environment. So look for an invite for that. In the meantime, everyone stay well, keep up with your own personal self-care, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Take good care.